To the world, she was Virna Lisi, the legendary, breathtaking icon of European cinema, the woman who possessed a face so blindingly perfect, so mathematically flawless, that poets wrote of her as a classical statue come to life, and Hollywood spent millions of dollars trying to buy her soul. To the public, the newspapers would report that she died of lung cancer, a sudden, merciless illness, diagnosed only 30 days prior. They would run black and white photographs of her in her youth, her platinum hair illuminated by studio lights, her eyes staring out with a haunting, timeless gaze. But those who truly knew her, those who had held her hand in the quiet hours and looked past the silver screen into her fading green eyes, knew a far deeper, more devastating truth. Virna Lisi did not die of cancer. She died of a broken heart. Exactly 451 days earlier, the very earth had shifted beneath her feet. Her husband, Franco Pesci, the man who had been her anchor, her lover, her protector, and her sanctuary for 53 years, had passed away. When Franco's heart stopped beating in the autumn of 2013, a vital part of Virna died alongside him. In medicine, they call it Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, a physical ballooning and weakening of the heart muscle brought on by catastrophic emotional shock. It is a condition where the left ventricle of the heart deforms under the sudden, agonizing rush of stress hormones, mimicking a massive heart attack. In layman's terms, the heart literally tears itself apart under the weight of grief. It is the body's physical surrender to an emotional absence. For Virna, this wasn't just a medical diagnosis. It was the inevitable conclusion of a life spent prioritizing human connection over everything else. Her son, Corrado, watched in silent, helpless sorrow as his mother, once an indestructible matriarch, a woman of fierce, unbreakable willpower who had commanded film sets and stared down studio bosses, began to literally shrink before his eyes. The light in her eyes, a light that had captivated millions across the globe for 6 decades, quietly and systematically went out. She spent her final year wandering the silent, echoing corridors of her home, whispering to a ghost, waiting for the day she could finally join him. The grand rooms that once echoed with the laughter of children, the clinking of wine glasses, and the warmth of massive Sunday dinner parties became a tomb of memory, a museum dedicated to a love that no longer walked the earth. Corrado realized that his mother's body was simply obeying her soul's demand to be reunited with the only man she had ever truly loved. To understand why a woman of such immense stature, wealth, and global adoration would let herself fade away for the love of a single man, we have to travel back to the very beginning. We must go to a time before the flashing cameras, the red carpets, and the deafening applause of international festivals. We must travel to a time when Virna was just a frightened little girl, clutching her mother's woolen skirt in the pitch black, learning what it truly meant to survive. She was born Virna Lisa Pieralisi in 1936 in the coastal, salt-swept city of Ancona, nestled along the blue curve of the Adriatic Sea. Her father, Ubaldo, was a hard-working marble exporter. He was a man of the earth, a man who understood the weight of stone, the honesty of sweat, and the absolute necessity of building things that were solid, durable, and safe. Ubaldo spent his days surrounded by massive blocks of travertine and Carrara marble, understanding that while human lives are fleeting, the stone we shape can last for millennia. From her father, Virna inherited a bone-deep appreciation for things that last, things that do not erode when the wind blows or shatter when the ground shakes. He would teach his young daughter how to run her fingers over raw, unpolished stone, showing her how to spot the deep, structural fractures hidden beneath a polished, beautiful surface. He taught her that true strength lies in what is underneath. But the world they lived in was anything but safe, and soon all the stone in Italy could not protect them from the madness of men. When Virna was just 7 years old, the sky above Ancona turned to fire. It was 1943, the height of World War II, and Italy had become a scarred, blood-drenched battlefield. Allied bombers, targeting the city's strategic Adriatic port and railway hubs, rained absolute destruction upon the civilian population. Over several terrifying months, wave after wave of heavy bombers darkened the sky, turning a historic maritime paradise into a screaming graveyard of dust and shattered brick. In those terrifying, endless months, Virna's childhood was not defined by play, by toys, or by laughter, but by the cold, damp, suffocating walls of underground air raid shelters. Imagine a young Virna, huddled in the absolute dark, surrounded by the deafening, bone-rattling roar of falling bombs. The explosions were so close, so violent, that the earth shook like a dying animal, and dirt fell from the reinforced ceilings like black snow, coating their eyelashes and filling their dry throats. Beside her in the dark was her mother, weeping silently, whispering frantic, breathless prayers into her hair, and her younger sister, Esperia, shivering with a combination of freezing cold and absolute terror. In those suffocating bunkers, packed tightly with weeping strangers who smelled of sweat, fear, and sulfur, Virna learned her very first, most profound lesson about humanity: that we are fragile, terrifyingly temporary creatures, and that when the world is collapsing around you, the only thing that keeps you alive, the only thing that keeps you sane, is the warmth of another human hand. It was in the darkness of those shelters that her core philosophy was forged. She realized that everything physical, houses, cities, money, possessions, could be vaporized in a single thunderous afternoon. The only real, enduring currency in this brutal life was the love you shared with the people beside you in the dark. This realization would become the compass of her entire existence, guiding every controversial, career-altering choice she would make decades later. When the sirens finally fell silent and the family emerged into the blinding daylight, there was nothing left of their family home but a pile of pulverized stone and smoking timber. The family joined the tragic, desperate exodus of refugees, the Sfollati, fleeing the ruins of Ancona to seek shelter behind the medieval stone walls of Jesi. They walked through a landscape of skeletal buildings and smoking craters, stripped of their security, relying entirely on the grace of strangers and the thin, watery soup of charity kitchens. To survive, they had to cling to one another with an intensity that only those who have lost everything can understand. This collective trauma of war left an indelible, permanent mark on Virna's soul. She grew up knowing, with absolute certainty, that fame, wealth, and beauty were nothing but fragile illusions, easily shattered by the march of history. While other young girls of the post-war era dreamed of Hollywood fairy tales and glamorous romances, Virna dreamed of safety, of solid walls, and of a family that could never be torn apart by the storms of the world. For her, security was not a luxury. It was a matter of psychological survival. By the early 1950s, the war was a fading scar, and Ubaldo moved his family to Rome, hoping to rebuild his shattered marble business from the ground up in a nation desperately trying to reconstruct itself. Rome was a city in transition, caught between the heavy poverty of the post-war years and the glittering promise of economic recovery. Virna grew into an incredibly quiet, diligent student, preparing for a sensible, quiet career in business administration. She wanted to work with numbers, to keep books, to live a life of predictable, peaceful obscurity, where everything could be neatly accounted for, balanced, and secured. But fate, as it so often does, had a different, far more turbulent path in mind for her. She was only 17 when a family friend, the popular singer Giacomo Rondinella, walked into their modest Roman apartment. He looked at Virna and was instantly transfixed. Her beauty wasn't just physical perfection, it was luminous, carrying the delicate, haunting vulnerability of someone who had survived the dark and kept her soul intact. He begged her father to let her take a screen test at the nearby Cinecittà studios, which was then emerging as the vibrant, chaotic heart of European filmmaking, a place where directors like Federico Fellini and Vittorio De Sica were rewriting the rules of cinema. Ubaldo was absolutely horrified. He was a conservative, traditional Italian father who loved his daughters with a fierce, protective jealousy. He knew the film industry was a carnivorous beast, a world that devoured young, innocent girls, commodified their bodies, stripped them of their dignity, and spat out their ruins. He had seen what happened to the starlets of Rome, and he refused to let his daughter become public property, a face plastered on the walls of cheap theaters for men to gawk at. He tried to lock the door. He tried to say no. But Virna, possessing the stubbornness of the very marble her father traded, insisted. She didn't care about the glamour, the costumes, or the fame. She saw an opportunity to help her family financially, to rebuild the security that the bombs of Ancona had stolen from them. She wanted to ease her father's heavy burden and ensure her mother and sister would never have to worry about a roof over their heads again. She entered the industry not out of vanity, but out of a profound sense of filial duty. She was willing to step into the terrifying glare of public life if it meant protecting the private sanctuary of her home. Faced with her iron resolve, Ubaldo made a choice. If he couldn't stop his daughter from entering the lion's den, he would become her shield. He became her manager, her shadow, and her guardian. He walked her to every single audition, holding her hand tight. He sat on every movie set, staring down producers and directors from the sidelines, a towering, silent wall of fatherly protection. If a director raised his voice, Ubaldo was there, his arms crossed over his chest. If a producer made an inappropriate suggestion in a closed office, they had to answer to a man who spent his life moving mountains of stone. It was a beautiful, protective partnership. In a world of wolves, Virna's father was her fortress, ensuring that even as she entered the glittering, cynical trap of Italian cinema, she remained completely untouched by its corruption. He taught her that her body was a temple, her talent was a craft, and her private life was a sacred territory that no ticket buyer had the right to own. This bond between father and daughter preserved her humanity in an industry designed to strip it away, keeping her grounded while her peers lost themselves in the intoxicating fumes of celebrity. But as her fame grew and her face began to adorn billboards across Italy, Virna felt a profound, hollow loneliness. She was surrounded by directors, executives, and adoring fans who looked at her with hunger, yet she felt entirely isolated. To the industry, she was a product, a beautiful, golden-haired doll to be dressed up and paraded around. She yearned for someone to look past the golden hair and the perfect jawline, to see the girl who had shivered in the air raid shelters of Ancona, the girl who valued substance over style. She wanted a love that was as solid and heavy as travertine, not a fleeting projection of light on a theater screen. Then, in the winter of 1959, the universe answered her prayer. In the wings of a Roman theater, she was introduced to Franco Pesci. He was an architect, a developer, a man of practical mind and passionate heart. He spent his days rebuilding Rome, constructing modern homes out of brick and concrete, helping a broken city stand tall once more. In a beautiful twist of poetry, she had found a man who, like her father, worked to make things solid and permanent. When Franco looked at Virna, he didn't see the rising star of Italian television or the blonde bombshell of the magazines. He saw the girl. He saw her depth, her quiet strength, and her underlying vulnerability. He courted her not with empty theatrical flattery or expensive jewels, but with a deep, quiet, consuming devotion. He would wait for her in the freezing rain outside film studios, not to take her to glamorous industry parties where people went to be seen, but to drive her home to her family. He talked to her about her parents, about her dreams, about building a real, quiet life away from the spotlights. He treated her like a human being, not an acquisition to be displayed on his arm. In Franco, Virna found the same protective, unwavering strength she had known in her father. He was a builder of foundations, and she was desperate for something that wouldn't shake. They married in the spring of 1960. It was, without question, the defining moment of her entire life. Franco was a traditional, sometimes fiercely jealous Italian man of his era. He openly hated the film industry, viewing it as a circus of vanity, false promises, and moral decay. He wanted his wife to belong to him, to their home, to their private sanctuary, not to the ravenous public. To the sensationalist press of the time, Franco's protective attitude was scandalous, labeled as patriarchal and backward. But Virna thanked God for his jealousy. To her, Franco's possessiveness wasn't a cage, it was an anchor. In a world where everyone wanted a piece of her, where producers wanted to own her image, and fans wanted to consume her beauty, Franco wanted to protect her from the world. It was the ultimate proof that he loved the woman, the wife, the mother, and not the celebrity. He didn't want to share her with the world because he understood her true, invaluable worth. For a girl who had watched her world turn to rubble at age 7, a husband who refused to let the world touch her was the greatest gift she could ever receive. When their son, Corrado, was born in 1962, Virna did something that shocked the entire entertainment world. At the absolute peak of her Italian fame, with directors begging for her time and contracts piling up on her desk, she walked away. She retired. She chose to stay home in their quiet apartment, to wash diapers, to cook Sunday ragu, to hold her baby, and to simply be Franco's wife. For 2 beautiful years, she lived in absolute blissful peace, wrapped in the quiet, sacred warmth of her family. She was no longer Virna Lisi, the star. She was Virna Pesci, the mother and wife. And she had never been happier. She had rebuilt the home the bombs had taken from her, and she was determined to live in it. But the world outside their apartment would not let her go. By the mid-1960s, Hollywood was in a state of absolute panic. Marilyn Monroe was gone, and the major studios were desperately searching for a blonde successor, a European import who could capture that same ethereal, tragic magic that drove audiences wild. They looked across the Atlantic and saw the breathtaking, platinum blonde Virna Lisi. Desperate to sign her, United Artists offered her a golden key to the kingdom, a massive 7-year, multi-million-dollar contract. It was a staggering sum of money, an amount that could secure her family's financial future for generations, ensuring that no war or economic collapse could ever make them homeless again. Against Franco's wishes, and fueled by a natural human curiosity to see if she could conquer the ultimate stage, she signed. They packed their bags, took little Corrado, and moved to Los Angeles, California. But Hollywood was not a dream. It was a deeply clinical, highly polished nightmare of isolation. The American studios didn't care about Virna's depth, her history, or her dramatic talent. They didn't care that she was a mother or a wife who had survived the ruins of war. To them, she was a piece of meat to be packaged, branded, and sold to the highest bidder. They immediately began to alter her appearance to fit their narrow mold. They dyed her hair a blinding, artificial white that burned her scalp and turned her hair to straw, painted a fake, seductive mole near her lips, and cast her in mindless comedies as the beautiful, brainless temptation. They wanted her to be the next Marilyn, a caricature of raw sexuality. They tried to strip away her Italian identity, her accent, her substance, trying to turn her into a hollow projection of male fantasy. They wanted a ghost, not a woman. On the set of the film Assault on a Queen, the legendary Frank Sinatra fell madly, obsessively in love with her. He was one of the most powerful, charismatic men in the world, a cultural kingmaker, and he pursued her with all the resources of his vast status. He sent mountains of flowers to her dressing room. He made grand promises of stardom. He offered her the world on a silver platter. Any other young actress would have yielded to the sheer gravity of Sinatra's attention, seduced by the power and the passion of the chairman of the board. But Virna looked at Sinatra, looked at the lavish, drug-fueled Hollywood parties, and felt only a profound, echoing ache. She saw through the illusion. She saw that Sinatra, for all his fame, power, and wealth, was a deeply lonely, tragic figure, surrounded by yes-men, but entirely devoid of real, unconditional love. He was a man who lived in the spotlight because the dark was too terrifying to face alone. She saw that Hollywood was a desert of lonely people who used each other to feel alive, only to discard one another when the spotlight shifted. In her trailer, away from the prying eyes of studio executives, she kept a single framed photograph of Franco and little Corrado. Every night, because of the 9-hour time difference, she would call Rome, crying hysterically, her voice cracking across thousands of miles of dark, cold ocean. While Hollywood executives toasted her success, she was weeping in the dark, desperately wishing she was back in Rome, cooking dinner for her husband. She was trapped in a gilded cage, surrounded by people who loved her image, but did not care if her heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces. She realized that the American dream was a hollow lie, a machine that traded human souls for celluloid fantasies. She starred alongside Jack Lemmon in How to Murder Your Wife, which became a massive box office success, but the victory tasted like ash in her mouth. She realized that the Hollywood machine was slowly, systematically eroding her marriage, her relationship with her son, and her very soul. She was losing the marble of her life, the heavy, permanent truth of her family, for the temporary, blinding glare of the spotlight. She was trading her humanity for a phantom. One afternoon, she walked into the wood-paneled offices of the studio executives who claimed to own her, looked them in the eye, and said, "Basta. Enough." The executives were stunned. No one walked away from Hollywood. They threatened her, they told her they would ruin her career, they promised to sue her for every penny she had and ensure she would never work in cinema again. They tried to break her spirit, to remind her that she was just an actress under contract. But Virna was the daughter of a marble exporter. She knew what was solid. She knew that her soul was not for sale, and that no contract could bind her spirit. She hired the most expensive, aggressive lawyers in America. To buy out her own contract, she paid an astronomical financial penalty, nearly her entire life savings. In today's money, it was a fortune. She walked away from millions of dollars, from the promise of global superstardom, and from the absolute peak of Hollywood glamour. She traded wealth for freedom, and stardom for her family. She got on a plane, holding Corrado tight, and flew back to Rome. When the wheels touched the tarmac in Italy, She threw herself into Franco's waiting arms and wept with pure, unadulterated relief. She had chosen her husband and her son over the entire world, and she never, for a single second of her life, regretted that choice. She had sacrificed her wealth to save her soul, and in Franco's embrace, she knew she had made the only bargain that mattered. She was home, and the walls around her were solid once more. Back in Europe, freed from the suffocating chains of being a Hollywood sex symbol, Virna's true artistry finally blossomed. She stopped playing the doll. She stopped hiding her age. As the years passed, she refused the plastic surgeries and the desperate attempts to cling to youth that consumed her peers. She allowed her hair to gray naturally. She refused to hide her wrinkles, viewing them as the beautiful, hard-earned map of a life fully lived, of a face that had laughed, cried, and loved without reservation. She actively sought out dark, complex, and deeply painful roles that other actresses of her generation avoided. She wanted to play real women, women who had suffered, women who carried the weight of the world on their shoulders, women who knew what it was to bleed and survive. In 1994, she took on the role of the ruthless, decaying, and monstrous Catherine de' Medici in the French historical drama La Reine Margot. To play the part, she insisted on having her teeth blackened, her hair shaved back, and her face made to look deathly pale, hollow, and cold. She stripped away every ounce of the beauty that Hollywood had tried to commodify, replacing it with a raw, terrifying, and masterfully human performance. She became the physical embodiment of power, corruption, and maternal tragedy. It was a triumph. The performance won her the Best Actress award at the prestigious Cannes Film Festival, making her the first actress to win for playing a villain. She had proven to her critics, and to herself, that her talent was far greater than her beauty, and that her art was as enduring as the stone her father had traded. She had conquered the cinema on her own terms, without sacrificing an ounce of her dignity. Yet, if you visited her in Rome and asked her what her greatest, most enduring achievement was, she wouldn't point to the Cannes trophy on her shelf, or her 6 silver ribbons, or any of her career achievement awards. She would tell you about Sunday dinners. For decades, the absolute center of Virna's universe was her home on the Kamalucha. Every Sunday, without fail, the heavy wooden doors of the villa were thrown open. Corrado, his wife Veronica, and her 3 beloved grandsons, Franco, Federico, and Riccardo, would fill the house with chaotic laughter, music, and the comforting smell of fresh basil, olive oil, and garlic. And there, at the head of the long wooden table, sat Virna and Franco. They were no longer the movie star and the architect. They were simply nonna and nonno. Beneath the linen tablecloth, even after 50 years of marriage, they would hold hands, their fingers locked together. Their love was as fierce, unbroken, and protective as it had been when they first met in the wings of that Roman theater in 1959. They had successfully built a fortress of humanity, a sanctuary of real, warm blood and bone against the cold, artificial winds of a superficial world. They had protected their children and grandchildren from the toxic glare of fame, raising them with the same values of honesty, hard work, and loyalty that Ubaldo had passed down to Virna in the shadow of the marble quarries. But the tragedy of a great, consuming love story is that one of you must always go first. In 2013, Franco's health began to rapidly fail. Virna immediately canceled all her professional engagements, becoming his primary nurse and constant guardian. She flatly refused to leave his bedside, sleeping on a small cot next to him so she could hear his every breath. She watched the man who had protected her from the wolves of the world for over half a century grow weak, his breathing growing shallow and labored. She held his hand, whispering to him in the quiet hours of the night, reminding him of their early days, of the diaper washing, of her escape from Hollywood, of the beautiful life they had fought so hard to protect. She thanked him for his jealousy, for his love, and for being her anchor. On September 23, 2013, Franco drew his final breath, his hand slipping from hers. With his passing, the fortress she had spent her life building crumbled into dust. Corrado watched in silent heartbreak as his mother entered a state of quiet, dignified, and terrifying surrender. She did not scream, she did not wail to the heavens. Instead, she became a shadow, moving through a world that had lost all its color. The silence in the massive Roman villa was deafening. She tried to go back to work, agreeing to film a television series just to appease her worried family, but her heart simply wasn't in it. She was just passing the time, going through the motions of a life she no longer wished to live alone. The anchor was gone, and she was drifting out to sea. When the doctors found the tumor in her lungs in November 2014, they pulled Corrado aside and told him it was terminal, that she had perhaps a month left. But Corrado didn't need the doctors to tell him. He already knew. He knew that the cancer was just the physical manifestation of a grief too heavy for her chest to carry. She had survived the horrific bombings of World War II. She had survived the predatory, soul-crushing jaws of Hollywood. But she could not and would not survive a world without her Franco. Her body was simply complying with the wishes of her soul. She was ready to lay down her shield and go to him. On the morning of December 18, 2014, Virna Lisi died peacefully in her sleep. She left behind a legacy of brilliant, timeless films, but more importantly, she left behind a profound, luminous testament to what it truly means to be human. She proved to a cynical world that when everything is stripped away, when the lights fade, when the fame dissipates, and when the money is gone, the only thing that truly matters is the connections we forge, the promises we keep, and the hands we hold in the dark. She had lived her life surrounded by marble and light, but in the end, she chose the warmth of a hand. And as she closed her eyes for the final time, one likes to think she was no longer in that quiet, lonely room in Rome, but back in the arms of her Franco, finally, eternally, home. I'm Sarah. Thanks for watching Beauty Meets Tragedy. Subscribe to the channel, as this will allow us to create more videos.